Totale from Florence. So we will start right now.
Firenze. Ciao. Ciao. So do you want me to just do presentation at this point? Okay, then I'm going to
I'll
do.
just do a short introduction.
Okay, great.
Lawrence Davis, undergraduate chair, associate professor of architecture in Syracuse University. The primary subject of inquiry for Lawrence Davis in his practice, research, and much of his teaching is the study of the ex-urban built environment. His seminar, Theories and Analysis of Exurbia, examines the underlying social, cultural, and technical circumstances that shaped this ubiquitous terrain over the last 250 years. He received a Master of Architecture degree from Columbia University after receiving a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Cincinnati and is a registered architect who maintains an active practice. Professor David is the current chair of the undergraduate program. He first held the position between 2003 and 2007, in addition to being past director of the school's noted study abroad program in Florence from 2008 and 2012. Davis's practice largely is focused on exurbia. In collaboration with Andrew Clemon, Davis was a finalist for the Center for Plainfield, Illinois, in the far periphery of Chicago. His work also explores the space between art and architecture. The design for a children's interactive gallery for the Everson Museum of Art, IMPI 1986, 68, sorry, in Syracuse, received a design citation from the ACSA. He frequently collaborates with other architects in Europe with Studio Ponzi in Florence, and currently in the Caribbean with the Atlantic Architecture Network, a wide-ranging design and research collaborative whom he co-directs with Tom Stanson. In addition to design, Davis writes mostly about the urbanism of diffuse cities. Currently in process, Changing American Exurbs explores the positive potential of ethnic diversity in the exurbs of the US. He also writes and has led studios about video and architecture, most recently the authoring of a video strip, The Aesthetics of Us, New Residents in Old Cities, for architectureplayer.com. So, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Again, thanks for the invitation. I visited the Vardiya exhibit when I was there in late May for the opening, and it was really a pretty amazing experience. I was really excited to see that video was a kind of theme as a way of rethinking or conceptualizing architecture. So it was being used and as a kind of didactic tool, but also a dialectic tool. So at this point, I think I'm going to try and put the whole screen on here. One second. Do you see the whole screen? Okay, I'm assuming that's yes. Correct?
Not yet.
Okay, I didn't do screen share. One second.
Okay.
I got to go back to screen share. Sorry about the technical naivete.
No worries.
Okay. And now that we have this? Yeah. Okay. Here, I'm going to start. I have a presentation here I'd like to give you. Now do you see it? Yes? Hello?
Yes, we see. Thank
you. Perfect. Okay. Anyway, I've always had an interest in video as a critical tool of thinking about life, and of course, this includes architecture. So it was really interesting again to see this whole pavilion based on the relationship of video to architecture. Both my friendship and collaborations with, Marco Brizzi and Paolo Giaconia at Image in Florence, and in the fact that here at Syracuse University, they have a very strong art program that focuses on video. And this has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of people argue that video art actually was born in Syracuse in the late 1960s. I think they intersect and they kind of fuel this interest. But, this presentation really isn't about that. and it attempts to connect this week's Vardiya theme, I think Carlos Scarpa and craft, to some themes in my practice and recent research. Like many, I'm attracted to Scarpa's work. However, I practice in a very different cultural setting. This creates a dilemma that I'll explain in a moment. So the presentation is an attempt to explain how an attitude, not a formal vocabulary, present in one's work can be translated into another place with a totally different logic of development. I will also describe how this attitude can operate at the scale of the city. In my case, the diffuse city of Exurbia in North America, and in particular, the United States. And when we get to the right moment, I'll explain what I mean by Exurbia. Some people aren't always clear about that. Now you should see an image of a detail of the handrail at the Corini Stampaglia. I suspect, you've all studied his work this week in this workshop. It's probably pretty interesting. But I think hopefully you also studied his attitudes and strategies, and hopefully you visit at least some of the works, of course, in Venice, of Avaletti Gallery, and then this one here at the Stampaglia. I think this detail is really interesting because it's emblematic of Scarpa's attitude that saw the detail as an assemblage of different parts, as a way to kind of celebrate and bring together different kinds of materials and new readings of those materials. In this case, modern steel can be read the same way as traditional wood. So historically, you would have made this post and connection with wood, but now you're actually making it as steel. Steel can also be cast in a very kind of fluid way as well and not look like that. So this translation of this particular material, steel, results in the ability of the work to speak to at least two different moments in history at the same time. Here is a bridge at the Castel Vecchio in Verona at a large scale. It's an insertion of something new into something old, into an older context. The steel again recalls the traditional use of wood as a spanning element nested in a larger masonry building. Concrete interprets masonry and makes a kind of cradle for this new steel intervention. And it's also another example of a kind of heterogeneous attitude at the scale of the construction joint, of course, but also now at the scale of the building, from room to room and between parts of a building. It is a highly detailed joint and a highly articulated spatial connection at the same time. And I would argue that this is a kind of collage mentality operating at least two scales. Both connections at both scales illustrate a kind of sympathetic relationship of a modern built intervention into a historic context, a sensibility about history that has always been present and important to Italian culture. Excuse me, let me get, oh, sorry. Next slide. Kenneth Frampton notes that Scarpa is one of the first to contextualize modern architecture. And in fact, he is mostly in the 60s. His attitude is that his work became, or Scarpa's work became, a kind of watershed moment in the evolution of 20th century architecture. In this sense, it's the first to sort of really aggressively try and create cultural connections. Maybe you could argue Alto does, and certainly Scarpa does a little later, but this is a kind of arguably new thing, he says, particularly at the level of construction joint. Collage is, again, the tool that he uses to connect disparate forces in a context. And there are many kinds of contexts operating here. Of course, there are material contexts, spatial contexts, cultural context, building culture context, the culture of construction and the construction industry in a particular place, economic and social contexts as well. Scarpa's work is most often interior architecture. This is, again, the Avaletti showroom, in particular renovations of existing buildings. But he also is very modern. Again, Frampton argues that a widely held quality of modern architecture is its emphasis on the interior, less of an emphasis on the facade or the elevation. And this is mainly driven by a more open, free plan. And so he takes these, what had been a series of rooms, and begins to open them up in a kind of modern way. The exterior is a secondary priority, unlike architectures of previous historic eras in which the facade was much more important. This means that the consideration of space and surface and the kind of surfaces that that space defines, or the kind of space that those surfaces define, excuse me, is really, really important. For Scarpa, the surfaces often have to do with a historical connection to Venice and the Veneto, whose traditional architecture is distinct because it uses mosaics and panels of stone. This gives a lighter, dematerialized feel to the building volume compared to, say, the classical architecture of Rome, which tends to be more monochromatic and heavier and sculptural in nature. In terms of culture and high craft, Scarpa's attitude is connected to a highly developed building culture in which high craft was a matter of life and death, you could argue. The shipbuilding industry was necessary for the Venetian Empire's survival. They had to have a good navy. And so this meant that the knowledge of shipbuilding was sort of translated into a kind of construction culture as well. And, you know, this DNA in the construction trades lasts or remains in Venice, at least until the 60s and 70s when Scarpa was there. I'm not sure about now, but it's a kind of interesting thing, I think, when you're thinking about craft as the kind of larger context that you're putting it in. And to sort of make a point, I'm going to now switch gears and sort of look at what craft might mean in the United States. And then that being a very important thing, understanding the larger context in which you're operating. As I noted, I was a fan of Scarpa from my student days. And in fact, I was so excited that when I began my practice, I designed a door in the manner of his approach. And I was told by the fabricator that it would cost $5,000. Half the budget of the small renovation I was designing. In a painful way, I realized the methods in production and the building cultures that supported them in the United States were very different than those of the Veneto and Venice. I found a solution, at least in terms of adjusting my attitude, in the early work of Frank Gehry in Los Angeles. And this, I mean, the late 70s and early 1980s. This is his famous house in Santa Monica. In this era, he was able to make interesting project with very common materials found at the local big box hardware stores and other building supply stores. It was like Duchamp had gone to Home Depot. I think it's the American equivalent of OBI. With common dimensional lumber, inexpensive veneers, borrowed parts, etc., Gehry was able to, like Scarpa, collage everyday suburban material, space, and form. In effect, he plays with the common building types of LA and by association, all the suburban building types found in North America. Arguably, Los Angeles is the most suburban, city we have in the US. He was able to understand and accept the dominant logic of development and means of construction, like Scarpa, and in his context, and make art. LA is very different than the Veneto and Venice, but Scarpa and Gehry share a deeper collage-like sensibility about putting things together. Collage, just sort of a sidebar here, collage was this kind of hidden ingredient in their own work. It is to the 20th century and modernity what perspective was to the 15th century and the Renaissance. It was a way of seeing and thinking about the world. The subject might be the same. In this case, a kind of very common still life of, cups and flower arrangements and tablecloths, etc. But as Rosalind Krauss, the art critic from the United States, particularly really well known in the 1980s, says, the subject of collage was not what was being painted, which was often quite ordinary, a portrait or a still life. The subject was the multiple ways of seeing it. So the subject is the verb of seeing versus historically the noun of the thing being represented. And this is a really interesting and important difference between what came before and then what came after collage. So there's a kind of movement that's emphasized in there. And I would argue the same thing can be said about a lot of Scarpa's work and a lot of Frank Gehry's work. There's a kind of implied representation of process in their work. I want to show quickly 4 projects. One is more conceptual to explain in a more aggressive way how I use collage and the different reality of craft in the American context. The others are about how I translated that attitude in more subtle ways to the renovations of everyday suburban homes. This allows one to see and think of ordinary things in new ways. At the end, if there's time, I want to briefly describe how one can envision this collage attitude applied at the scale of the city in North America, and particularly the diffuse city of Exurbia. This is a drawing of the Children's Gallery for the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, New York here. It is a plan with the perspective vignettes kind of folded out, a kind of perspectival collage. It illustrates an attitude about the collage-like sensibility of the project, combining space, function, and views. It was an attempt by me to bring together different views, movement, and experiences that you had in the project into one drawing. On the top is a picture, exterior picture of the building that it's in by I.M. Pei. It was his first museum, a beautiful brutalist composition of kind of 4 large concrete volumes slowly pinwheeling around a center atrium. It has this beautiful concrete spiral stair. And it was completed in 1968. The bottom is a kind of programmatic diagram of all the different things that the thing is supposed to do. The Children's Gallery's main purpose is for them to experience art by understanding the process of making it. In this case, they can make art that is connected to the museum's 2 strong collections, one in portraiture and the other in ceramics. The gallery is also a critique of curating art as a critical practice. For this, I borrowed the idea of Wunderkammer. The idea is a reference to the first cabinets of curiosity that emerged in the Renaissance and Baroque. During the Age of Discovery, aristocrats would use these cabinets and spaces to house and exhibit their collections of all types of things, from art to taxidermy. Things were brought back from Africa and the Americas during the Age of Discovery, and many argue that these first cabinets or these rooms that were, to hold the collections of aristocrats became the first kind of proto-museums, that they evolved into the first museums, let's say at the end of the 18th, early 19th century. These are 2 portraits. One on the left is Alexander Button, a kind of 19th century portrait in the collection. The other is another one by Cindy Sherman of unnamed subject. They were selected to help develop a critical understanding of the painting type of portraiture. Alexander Button's is he's very traditional. He has clothing and jewelry to support the reading that he's a established and successful businessman. Cindy Sherman is an example of a contemporary feminist photographic portrait that is on purpose nameless and looks submissively up to the viewer and speaks to the traditional role of women in society illustrated through portraiture. What students would do, they would go look at those portraits, probably with a curator or a docent, and they would then draw their own portraits, and then they would go and put on some clothes that somehow they had in this space here, and then they would have their picture taken by this little kiosk and get a little Polaroid portrait of it, and then that portrait would be projected again at the entry. So in a sense, they constructed their own identity in their own portrait. So this is how you learn about portraiture, by doing it. I don't know if this works here, if this arrow works, but this is the entry. You come up back here, and this is where there was a table. There were clothes along this area. There's a backdrop here. You saw in the previous image, this was the kiosk, and this is where the picture was taken. Over here was this kind of Wunderkammer of ceramics and some pieces from the permanent collection. And then this was a table where children would make ceramics and put their pieces in sort of open parts of this cabinet. The material palette, I think, is important. This is what maybe connects it in some way to Frank Gehry's work, I guess, or similar attitudes, is that the veneer plywood matched the millwork in the museum. So there was a lot of other cabinets with the same use of wood. The wood is lighter and is, as a result, a kind of contrast to the heavy concrete of the building. The frame and the skin palette also speaks to the theatric and provisional nature of the gallery's function. It's like a little tiny temporary theater, if you will. And this, of course, is reinforced by the fact that it's made of a kind of dimensional lumber frame that's exposed often. Again, it made for a very playful repertoire of material and form and space that was really a contrast to the more heavy, quite beautiful though, parent building of IMP made by concrete. The idea of the Wunderkammer plays itself out in the cabinet that serves the frame the ceramics for the children, and it also has a kind of idea about, well, what do you put in there, what don't you put in there? You can begin to talk about that if you wish. It's a pretty advanced conversation, I realize, for, let's say, an 8-year-old, but it was one of the things that the curators there wanted to have. These are just a few drawings. This is an elevation of the Wunderkammer. This is a drawing of the kiosk, and these are a kind of exploded axonometric of the you know, the frame, the skins, and then the other programmatic elements. As noted, collage was the operative attitude and technique to integrate a variety of heterogeneous issues, from diverse programs, material contrast, to the composition of views, circulation, form, and space. But, yeah. All these connect to kind of physical context of a large concrete building, its function, and its space. This next set of exurban projects, quickly, I want to talk about quickly to speak to how this collage-like attitude might affect projects, you know, in a more common built environment. These places are, particularly in exurbia, suburbia, is frequently maligned by architects as one of that is overly fragmented, isolated, and ultimately corrosive, but nonetheless ubiquitous. It's found everywhere. There's a lot to say about why this is the case. I won't get into that. I have a whole course about that, but I can come back and talk about that if you want. There are entire books on the subject that I can recommend as well if you're interested in that. But in summary, the North American suburb, at least, is truly modern. It systematically classifies and separates functions as a way to manage them. The most important function is the domestic realm, where the construction of privacy is the primary tool of control. What this means for architecture is that the city is that, in particular, the lawn, you know, the grass lawn, is a kind of picturesque tool to separate the house from other people and other functions, and at the same time frame the house as a symbol of the occupant's prosperity. This is a good moment to explain why I use, I think, the term exurbia rather than suburbia. I prefer the term exurbia over suburbia because it is in much of the urban development in the United States, the settlement of the edge is no longer subordinate to the center. In fact, it is a new kind of city, a kind of polycentric, low-density urban field that contains the major civic functions that historically were all concentrated in the city. They're no longer there. They've been spread around this kind of multi-pole urbanized region, hence the term exurbia. I think it's more accurate to describe that kind of a city. The urban field is no longer subordinate to anything. It is the thing. This project here is a community space I did in Cincinnati. Outside of Cincinnati is very, very low budget. Everything like early Frank Gehry work, I guess, was from off-the-shelf lumber supply stores. Unlike Scarpa, nothing is customized or highly crafted. The idea was to use common materials, forms, and colors to make a public space around an existing swimming pool for an existing apartment complex. It attempts to ground this pool and this building with this fence, so there's a kind of outside space, and then a kind of series of volumes that begin to talk about having a conversation with some of these other buildings, as well as creating a kind of entry. It's the first building you see when you come into the complex. And people would go into this bigger volume, this room here, and look at, you know, have social gatherings, watch sporting events, things like that. This is the floor plan. Again, the big room. Excuse me, my mouse is not working. There's a big room looking at the pool. Again, everything is made of very inexpensive materials. This next project is a split level house and is in suburban Syracuse. It's a very typical 60s and 70s house. It's on top of a hill with a good view back over a forest, which is what primarily drive the intervention. They wanted a room on the back. This is a diagram I made, and the idea was to add a family room that connects the kitchen to the view and to other existing elements in the backyard and patio, like a porch and a deck. It makes and connects things with a single move to adjacent elements, but also to a distant context. For me, it was an opportunity to connect an existing house type through a formal and spatial distortion. Let's see if I can explain it. This is a kitchen. This is a big room. You can kind of look down this valley at a large kind of forest, and this is where you would spend most of the time. I'll show you a few pictures of that in a minute. And in plan, it's just essentially added to the back to connect this back set of spaces with the main house. And this is another kind of perspectival plan. This is actually the boundary of the house. And then there are little vignettes here that explain what you would be seeing if you looked in different ways. You can sit here and look down, or look across over to here, or look over into this part of the house. This is a quick perspective of it. This was the project under construction. Wood frame is very fast and flexible and inexpensive in America. One of the problems of production here is that the cost of labor is very high. And so time is actually more valuable than materials. And so you have to figure out how to build things in quick ways in order to keep in a budget. The millwork is like a flexible sleeve. It sort of slides inside this larger volume that's just painted sheetrock or drywall. And I thought of it as almost like a thickened folded paper. And it also, again, connects this space down here to this space up here, which is the kitchen, which I'll show another picture of right here. So it's a way of sort of using it as a way of sort of folding and bending it. And the same attitude exists on the exterior. It was a shingle house, and so we just stretched the shingle around the new volume and, emphasized connections and special moments within the facade to keep it coherent and connected to the existing building, but not exactly the same. This last project is another renovation about 1 kilometer from the other one that you just saw. It's an existing house and garage, and the program was not just a residence, but an artist studio and a writer's sort of study, if you will, for this couple. One is an artist and the other is a writer. So this is the uphill side, and then this is the downhill side. And I'll show you some diagrams in here. These are some early sketches. I like to do a lot of freehand drawings first, and trying to study different views and relationships between inside and outside, between different volumes and adjacent spaces, those kinds of things. Another diagram by hand and a model. I like paper and cardboard models because I can change them quickly and easily. It's very, very forgiving in that way. I don't have to send it to the digital fabrication shop and get in line and wait and realize I made one wrong data entry and the whole thing doesn't work. There's a drawing of the exterior about how these volumes then are set into the site and are trying to interconnect with the larger site, but also each other, and also at the same time begin to express the function of the program. Basically, you park your car up here. You can come down to the house. That's how most people would come. But you can also come into an upper level of the study for the artist, the sculptor, or you can come through here. There's a stair that connects them, and there's a double height space on this side. Down here on the ground floor, you'll see there's a kind of family room. The study for the writer is here, and then there is a kind of L-shaped closet thing I'll show you in a minute, and bookcase that connects different parts of the building, or on the first floor, and on the upper floor is the kitchen and a living and dining area. This was the garage as built, board and batten constructed, very common, emphasizing the idea that this is like a sheet of paper almost that could begin to designate where entry is, and sort of wrap around the volumes in a fluid way is something that was very much on my mind when I was designing this thing. Also, you can then use this as a way to begin to articulate different volumes and how they sit in the site. This is a perspective, or a set of, photographs of the stair inside the artist studio. It's a double height space that you go up this stair, and up here is a little study or workspace. And this is just looking at it from downhill. There's an adjacent outside yard for them to work in. The attitude in the lower volume was a kind of folded storage zone with bookcases, closets, things like that. It ended up in the master bedroom suite. And there was also a fireplace for the family room. So the family would be spending a lot of more private time down here versus the public spaces, which were above. And there you can see when it was built, what it's like. You can insert the bookshelves into this thickened wall. You can let a little light into the corridor, and it becomes an opportunity too to nest all sorts of interesting programs, like just a place to sit, or desks, bookcases, things like that. The idea of folding extends to various work surfaces as well. I use a product called 3Form on the kitchen counter. Plywood in the desk in the studio are also used in a similar kind of folding way. Very simple, but very inventive. Actually, the contractor became a collaborator because he actually came up with this detail here. So it folded over and came down. So it's really interesting when you have a good person to build with. I'm sure Scarpa had this much better than I did and more regularly than I did, but it's a really satisfying thing. Invention is often a reaction to real problems. One of the problems we had here was that this was an older part of the house than this, and they built the two major beams in a way for the gable roof that did not align. You can see it here. And so we had to come up with something that would sort of hold that up. We wanted to there was a wall there previously, and we wanted to open it up. Again, the level of craft in upstate New York is not that of Venice. And so it's an example of using a Scarpa-like tectonic mentality in a much more straightforward and inexpensive way. And here you can see the kind of results spatially. Kitchen, there's a bedroom actually there, and then these were just other spaces around it, pinwheeling around these two columns. It also helped to sort of phenomenally ground the project, creating a kind of division between these same spaces. How am I doing on time? Okay, I hope so. I have about 10 more minutes. Okay.
So we still have time, but then we have to leave the pavilion in 20 minutes. So maybe 10 more minutes would be great. Yeah.
I'll keep that in mind.
Okay.
Okay. Now I just really quickly here. This is my more recent work. I'm working on a book called Changing Exurbs, which has a kind of double meaning. Of course, they are changing, but we should change them. And well, I'll just start with this picture. This is a map of the United States prepared by the Geography Department at the University of Virginia. Each dot represents a person. The blue dots represent Caucasian or white people. Your red dots represent Asian people. The yellow dots represent Hispanic people, and the green dots represent Black people. This is an image from the 1970s of the photographer Bill Owens. He's well known for using suburbia as a subject. The image is, I think, representative of what many people thought suburbia was for, or who lived in it. It's definitely the image that I grew up in. I grew up in suburbia very much like this. We had a sailboat instead of a motorboat, but it was very similar. And so you can see here are 5 blue dots, and probably living in a sea of the blue dots. This is a close-up of the suburbs of Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C., using that same map. The really cool thing about this map is that you can zoom in really far. There are many blue dots, but there are also many other colors too. What's this mean? Suburbia has become the main site of ethnic and cultural diversity in the United States. My question is how can this change affect spatial practices moving forward? How will this change the actual physical nature of suburbia? Just a couple of other quick charts. This one looks at the growth since 1920 of traditional and non-traditional residents in suburbia. You can see the percentage of growth of foreign-born people in suburbia is much more than native-born. That's, I think, important. So when people are moving from other countries to the United States, they're not moving to the center cities, they're moving way out to the edge. This looks at notes that Hispanics are the fastest growing group of people, both in cities and outside of cities in the United States. This basically looks at the rate of growth for the different groups. White people's only about 4%, whereas everybody else is 8 to 10, maybe even a lot more, like 13%. So that's interesting. What's this mean for the built environment? In most cases, these new residents are reusing and modifying existing buildings. That said, they are using them differently. Latino urbanism is a phrase now that's being used in California, particularly uses the front yard in a more public way. The lawn is no longer a barrier, but a space of social connection and interaction. That's on the left. The parking lot on the right is a kind of Asian American urbanism. In this case, they use an old mall. They use it for a night market or a Lunar New Year celebration, other kind of public functions. This is a map of Westminster, California. It's about an hour drive south of downtown Los Angeles. It has the largest Vietnamese community in the United States. On the left there, the red part. The yellow part way over here is Santa Ana. It has a very large Hispanic community. It's also the home of Disneyland. Maybe some of you have been there. This is that Asia Garden Market in Westminster, which is now in that Vietnamese community I was talking about, and their sort of remodeling and reuse of the space of this old dying mall. There are lots of malls that are sort of becoming obsolete. Amazon shopping online has definitely contributed to that, and so we're creating what are called experience environments, and this is a kind of a homegrown experience environment by the community there. Asian Garden Mall is an old mall that was retrofitted to the specific tastes of their community, and it's an example of a kind of transformed spatial practice. It's part of a phenomenon across North America of Asian malls, largest in Carolina and Vancouver and Toronto. They're characterized by smaller family-run stores or stalls, and they do not have any large-scale retail like large department stores. Another example of this is up near San Francisco at a place called Mission Hills. It's a good example of what can happen in the domestic environment when there is a large-scale ethnic transformation. In this case, affluent or wealthy Asians who work in Silicon Valley want their children to go to good schools, so they wanted to move to this particular community. They tend to also have larger families and extended families. These were the traditional homes of this area, these kind of low-slung 50s, 60s suburban houses with a big front yard. They average about 250 square meters. The people that lived here were wealthy, but sort of baby boomers or even their parents. And again, they had these kind of large open plan living rooms and kitchens that were opening out to these backyards, which are also very functional, a kind of outdoor room where you can have a barbecue and cook and eat, and it's a kind of lifestyle, a kind of prairie home lifestyle. The new residents of Asian descent have bought the ranch home sites and actually demolish them and replace them with larger homes that average around 500 square meters. They're taller. The yard and garden are often paved. They tend to use traditional architectural symbols like gables, towers, classical arches that attempt to represent the affluence of the owner. The large size accommodates the extended families, but also more conspicuous. It also allows them to have a kind of more conspicuous symbol of prestige and transformation. This whole change also did not come about without any kind of resistance. The older residents, of course, were horrified by these new houses. But at a certain point, you get enough people of a certain group, a certain like mind, and they can change. They can begin to influence the local government to change the zoning laws, the building laws, to allow this kind of new building type. The interiors are more formal also, and attempt to recall sort of aristocratic classical spaces of Europe. And the gardens, too, are places that show more casual outdoor spaces compared to the ranch homes. And of course, lots more closet space to store all the stuff you buy. This next last example here is a demographic map of the western sector of Phoenix. It's called Maryvale. And note, it's mostly Hispanic. It's yellow. Maryvale was built after World War II as a kind of western Levittown, particularly for people who wanted to retire in a warm climate. And, you know, it's part of a whole kind of marketing, building, financing machine that began to develop after the war, and used people like Ronald Reagan, who at that point featured on the right here, young Ronald Reagan, as a kind of actor to help promote the development. And you would go to one of these model homes, look at what you wanted, and then order yours. So these became sort of a kind of test home, if you will. This is that same group of home. Now it's largely a relatively poor Hispanic neighborhood with a lot of crime, unfortunately, a lot of other social problems that come with poverty. But they're using the front yards in very different ways. Maybe these people are still left over from before, but it's a kind of there's a kind of transformation happening. It's not as picturesque or beautiful as, let's say, the previous one, or certainly not as wealthy, but it's also something worth paying attention to. And again, what they tend to do is use the front yard, even in their own modest ways, in a more social way. The lawn, also, you have to remember, lawn maintenance is very expensive, particularly in Arizona, where water is expensive. And so if you're poor, that's one of the first things you take out of your budget. This is another picture. It's all part of this kind of Latino urbanism. Again, it's a culture that emphasizes social interaction over privacy, particularly in the front yard. So the purpose of the front yard changes. This change in function makes the front yard more decorative, more functional. The fence, too, becomes a kind of representational element. And you tend to see all kinds of little elements and monuments, popular decorations. This is the Virgin of Guadalupe, very important to Mexican culture, and a very beautiful decorative fence. And then the fence, too, can also be a kind of informal residential, or excuse me, retail space. It becomes a part of where the home begins to engage with the public realm. Just again, the one person, and I'll talk really briefly, there's a lot more to say about this, is looking at this as someone like Teddy Cruz. This is the border between Tijuana and San Diego, and he looks at neighborhoods like San Ysidro and talks about looking at how zoning here, you can see it's much more dense, much more interactive in terms of different kinds of functions, from public to residential is yellow, red is retail, and I think purple is industrial, but you can see it's much more mixed up here. And this is the kind of white part of San Diego. But as you go south in San Diego, you get closer to Hispanic culture, and they're starting to be able to sort of change the building laws in ways that allow for different functions to happen in a more fine-grained way. And this is a close-up of that. Again, his priority is not just on physical density, but on the density of social interactions. That's really what makes a town better, and that's more appropriate for this particular group. And then it's inspired a lot by the informal development on the urban peripheries across Latin America, like the favelas of Brazil. I think this one happens to be in Mexico. Again, these tend to be multifunctional, more relaxed kind of compositions of streets and buildings and various kinds of spatial relationships. He talks about using existing parts, spare parts, hence the title of the lecture today, in ways that are very inventive and open up space below the house. This is actually an existing house that may have been bought in San Diego and brought across the border and then lifted up. And then with these structural elements on the left here, one can create a kind of scaffolding that lifts up the house, but also creates a kind of semi-public, private retail space, activity space, social space below the house. And it's a really interesting issue. But it's another example of how an attitude about craft has to adjust to a social and economic reality of the place. So I'll conclude by arguing that this kind of messy, unregulated architecture of Estudio Cruz is just as considered in terms of craft as Scarpa. The big difference is that this is what craft will tend to look like in a setting that is less affluent, less wealthy. And that said, the low craft culture can still be designed. It just needs to embrace a different set of values. This is just an image of them kind of put together. It's produced by Estudio Cruz as well. And again, it speaks to the fact that new functions, new cultural beliefs, and ways of arranging spaces to accommodate and illustrate things can begin to change, I think, the pattern and texture of Exurbia. So that's all I have. I sort of really raced through the last part. There's a lot more to say, but I wanted to maybe take a question or two. I'm going to click out of this.
So, Professor Davis, thank you very much for this very inspiring talk.
Thank you.
As we have seen in our experience here in Venice, many of the workshops that Scarpa was working with actually going to close down probably in a decade or so. So we were also talking about would there be a way of sustaining them without just resuscitating them just for the sake of protection. So maybe these new and exorbitant type of practices might be maybe a way of sustaining this type of production practice.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that's a good question because I'm going to take my headphone off and talk like this. But it's a good question because I think that one of the arguments I'm trying to make is that craft and the idea of craft has to connect to the reality of production wherever you are. And so obviously in the case of Mexico and it's not particularly high in the kind of traditional sense of the word, but it is still just as inventive and has to deal with how you make things work in a kind of less developed environment, a less developed economy. And again, I think what's really interesting about particularly Latino urbanism is it's kind of very socially intense, and the idea of privacy has changed. So the house has, the spatial relationships have to change, but also how you make the house has to change as well. And because they have a kind of, I didn't talk about this, but they also have a kind of low, what's a bottom-up kind of economic system for actually paying for these things. They have sort of micro loans. They have a lot of community influence or input into how things are going to be made. They don't deal with big banks. They don't deal with big bureaucracies. They try to do a lot of this stuff at a very kind of grassroots, as we say, local level. And I think that's one of the interesting things. And so when that happens, you're going to get another whole kind of texture and intensity, maybe even a kind of intimacy with building with what's at hand to the people that are actually living in it.
So I guess we have one more question.
Great.
If you like to share. Great. Yeah.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
Your work's quite nice. I really like it. And I think you approach it in a very nice theoretical manner. And it's quite interesting with our experience here in terms of engaging with Scarpa. You know, a big thing has been his relationship with the people that he's engaging with. And I find it quite interesting how you talk about how you, in a completely different context, and you having to, it is a comparison in terms of still working with what you have. And it's kind of this thing that's come out of our workshop is this realization that Scarpa is working with what he has. And although he's amazing at what he did, it is this kind of thing about making small gestures. And I think also just the connection that you made at the end on an urban scale and just re-saying your line, kind of urban is no longer subordinate, I think is quite interesting, because I come from South Africa and I think it's very similar to the context in which you're talking about. And I kind of make that connection as well.
Oh, South Africa is really interesting. I can imagine a lot of kind of improvisational urbanism, or the potential for improvisational urbanism to be quite high. Yeah, I mean, I think the context that you work in isn't just the place. You know, there's a kind of building culture that has developed in Venice over many, many centuries. But it's also the time. And so this point that was made even in the last question, where, well, the workshops are closing down, that kind of culture doesn't exist as much anymore. You know, that's always true. Like, you always hear this saying in the United States, at least, they don't make them like they used to, like in the olden days. Well, they never will. I mean, that's not the point. The point is, like, how do you make things now? How do you make it interesting? How do you make sort of ordinary construction things in ways that relate to the people that are going to be using them, but also make them accessible to them as well, in terms of their ability to be fabricated and constructed, and in that way, I really like Studio Cruz's idea that, look, good design is something that everybody deserves, not just people who can afford it. And one of the problems with a lot of the parametric design these days, is as beautiful as it is that it's still pretty difficult for some people to make. Now, I think that's going to change. I think maybe in 20 years it could change, and then I would have to sort of adjust this talk in a way to accommodate that. You know, the logic of production will include a kind of more common common way of building. But I think that with digital fabrication, you know, the guy will have a little 3D printer on the back of his pickup truck and then, you know, build a piece that he needs right there. You might even have more customization. But I think it's an interesting point and an interesting question. Thanks.
Hi, I have a question. Because
Sure.
you mentioned craft is connected to reality of production, and you mentioned Teddy Cruz. I just wonder, in these Latino, or for example, like less wealthy community, instead of using Teddy Cruz's method of, like, for example, like modern methods of buying houses from the States and stuff, do you think there's more indigenous ways, or like primitive approach towards crafts? And do you think that could be carried on? Yeah.
When you say permitted means of craft, what do you mean by that? I want to
primitive.
Like, oh, okay. Sorry.
Indigenous. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, you know, I think one of the things Teddy Cruz wants to sort of say is that his way of putting things together is pretty, you know, primitive. I mean, they're sort of found parts, tires and you know, old scaffolds in old houses, even parts of old houses, windows and doors, but I think that that's a really interesting question, because I mean, the other person I didn't talk about today was, you know, Aravena, and Alejandro Aravena at Elemental. And when, you know, he does those half houses, part of the way that they're able to make that kind of a project work is that part of that project is very systematic. And, you know, of course you can get a kind of economy of by, you know, repeating something over and over again, economies of scale. And then, you know, you come in later and do the other half of the house. I guess I guess the word primitive to me would have to be, you know, relative. I think in certainly in Africa, I have some friends who teach there, and how, you know, there's a whole nother kind of logic of how you would make something, what makes sense, where you would make, you know, kind of more technical interventions, let's say, through infrastructures, but then the rest of it sort of letting that go. So I guess I would think that, again, depending on the culture, you have to kind of be selective where you put your emphasis, where you put your focus on developing things, and where you kind of let it go and relax a little more. And, you know, I think in the case of Teddy Cruz, it might be those scaffolding pieces, and then you put things onto them, and he doesn't even know what they're going to put onto them. All he knows about is the scaffolding. Maybe that's what architects do. That's sort of what Elemental does a little bit, only a little more assertively, I suppose. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, for primitive, I was actually meaning like more indigenous ways. Like in South America, there are a lot of like tribal communities, and they have great, like, for example, lashing methods, or using, I know, wood in a very traditional, like ancient manner. Or like in Asia and the Pacific, they just use nature as a material instead of. Do you think these kind of approach could combine with this modern, like recycling, like construction waste, for example? Like, could these join? And
yeah, I think so, because in those are different kind of contexts than the one that Teddy Cruz is working in. I mean, Mexico is very much a country that gets kind of the leftovers, particularly with cars. There's so many American used cars that are sort of bought and then, you know, driven down in, or, you know, shipped down in mass in Mexico, and people buy them, and they're really good at fixing them up and, you know, making their country go. And the same thing, I think, with housing and building parts. That might have been the inspiration for Teddy Cruz. But I think what you're talking about is a culture that may not be so adjacent to or connected to a more highly industrialized country. And so, yeah, sure. I think what's interesting about that is then you could have all kinds of less developed ways of construction that are connected to very specific, you know, values and techniques and kind of logics, if you will, of the people at hand. But at the same time, then what happens when all of a sudden they get like the internet in that house or in that community, or they get some kind of, you know, increasing amounts of contact with other cultures beyond that? How does that begin to come into that culture? I have a hard time denying anyone access to anything that allows them to have more knowledge and to be more successful. I don't want to, but at the same time, obviously, that can turn into its own kind of monster and overwhelm a very particular kind of culture. So there's a real kind of, it's a difficult thing. I don't know if you can manage it, but you can imagine there could be a kind of sweet spot between you know, something that's very culturally specific and connected to its history, and then something that is still giving people it to their advantage, a connection to the outside world. And this would involve also technology and elements of building and the way you build as well.
So, Professor Davis, you can see our pavilion is darkening in the background.
I see.
And we are about to be kicked out. That's cool. We're about to be kicked out of the Arsenal in any moment now. But your lecture was so inspiring, and I think our whole experience this week made us kind of believe more in the interconnectedness of everything, that there are no uninterrelated things, so everything comes kind of together. And thank you for this valuable addition to our workshop and our subject in general.
Thank you. It's very interesting questions, and it's been a real pleasure to be a part of your, I think, very interesting initiative. It's one of the most interesting pavilions I've seen in a long time. It's really about how people engage and interact through a new medium, and I think that's important. So congratulations to you.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations to you.
Have a nice day.
Okay. Take care. Okay. I'm going to sign off. If I can.